Dzień dobry Państwu. Nazywam się Michał Paweł Markowski. Jestem szefem Katedry Literatury Polskiej i Języka Polskiego na University of Illinois w Chicago i jednocześnie dyrektorem artystycznym Międzynarodowego Festiwalu Literackiego imienia Józefa Konrada w Krakowie, który co roku odbywa się w tym mieście. Nasze dzisiejsze spotkanie ma określony scenariusz, ale jednocześnie otwarte jest na niespodzianki. W związku z tym, że festiwalu obowiązują 3 oficjalne języki, język angielski, język ukraiński, język polski. Ja będę mówił w języku polskim, nasz gość David Grossman będzie mówił w języku angielskim, Adam Michnik będzie, jak przypuszczam, mówił w języku polskim, teraz będziesz mówił w języku po ukraińsku. Naszymi gośćmi są, zacznę od naszego gościa z Izraela, Davida Grossmana, która obecność jest tutaj nieprzypadkowa z wielu względów. Jest to jeden z najwybitniejszych, uznawany przez krytyków literackich na świecie za jednego z najwybitniejszych pisarzy współczesnych. Wielokrotnie nagradzany, ostatnio nagrodą księgarzy niemieckich, nagrodą pokoju księgarzy niemieckich. Jego związki z Brunonem Schulzem są oczywiste dla wielu. Jest autorem książki Patrz pod miłość, których jednym z głównych bohaterów jest Bruno Schulz, o którym pewnie dzisiaj będzie Dawid mówił. Dawid jest nie tylko pisarzem, ale publicystą, aktywistą politycznym, działa na rzecz pokojowego współistnienia państw na Bliskim Wschodzie, Izraela i państw ościennych. Bardzo proszę Davida Grossmana o przedstawienie jego własnej prezentacji. David, you may please take the floor. You're going to be lecture? Yes, okay.
Shalom and good morning to all of you. I'm very glad to be here with my wife for the first time. Once, when he was a boy, on a melancholy evening, his mother Henrietta walked into his room and found him feeding grains of sugar to the last houseflies to have survived the cold autumn. Bruno, she asked, why are you doing that? So they will have strength for the winter, he said. It seems that everyone who loves Bruno Schulz has his or her own personal tale of discovery. To me it happened just after I published my first novel, The Smile of the Lamb. You know, when there is a new writer in town, it's like a newborn baby in the family. When a new baby is born, he comes from the unknown. Nobody knows about him. And the family has to find a way to connect with the baby, to make it a little less alien, more accessible in his newness and mystery. So the relatives are leaning over the infant's crib and peer at it closely and say, look, he has the nose of Uncle Yankel, or his chin is exactly like Aunt Malka's. Something similar happens when you first become a writer. Everyone rushes to tell you who has influenced you, from whom you have learned, and of course from whom you have stolen. More than once, after my learned critic had informed me who was my influence, who inspired me and from whom I had stolen, I went and read those writers, mostly for the first time, and realized that my critics were absolutely right. I was influenced, inspired, and maybe also stolen from these inspirations. One day I received a telephone call from a man named Daniel Shilit, who was a Polish Jew who came to live in Israel. He had read my book, The Smile of the Lamb, and he said, you obviously are greatly influenced by Bruno Schulz. I was young and polite, and it also sounded like a compliment, so I didn't argue with him. The truth is that up to that moment I had not read a single story by Schulz. But that very evening, at a home of friends, I happened to come across the Hebrew edition of his collected stories. I borrowed and I read it. I read the whole book in several hours. Even today, it is hard for me to describe the jolt that ran through me. When I got to the end of the book, I read the epilogue by the Hebrew translator Yoram Brunovsky. And there, for the first time, I came upon the story or the legend of how Schulz has died. And Brunovsky wrote, in the Drohobych ghetto, Schulz had a protector, an SS officer, who had exploited Schulz to paint murals on the walls of his house. The rival of this SS officer shot Schulz in the street in order to provoke the other officer. According to the rumor, wrote Brunovsky, when they met thereafter, one told the other, I have killed your Jew, and received the reply, all right, now I will go and kill your Jew. Now, Schulz's many admirers know the story that I just told about the circumstances of his death. There are some who believe that although Schulz was indeed killed in the Drohobych ghetto, that terrible exchange of words was fabricated, an anecdote. The debate between advocates of the various versions of Schulz's death has endured for decades. 4 years ago in Israel, by chance, I met an elderly man named Zeev Fleischer, who had actually witnessed the murder of Schulz and was convinced that the killing was random, not deliberately aimed at Schulz. Apparently there is no way to settle this issue, this debate, and it might be useful here to recall the words of the Argentinian writer Ernesto Sabato, written in another context altogether. And so wrote Sabato, anecdotes are essentially faithful to the truth, precisely because they are fictional, invented detail by detail until they fit a certain person exactly. So even if the story about the Gestapo officers is fiction, it touches us deeply because the tale is still faithful in its essence to the truth, to a certain tragic and ironic truth about the man Bruno Schulz, to his sense of existential otherness, his feelings of unworthiness and insignificance. I remember that after I have read these awful words, I closed the book, I left my home and walked around in a nearby field for a few hours. I walked as if in a fog. I couldn't bring myself to go home. I didn't understand how it was possible to live in a world in which such acts were possible, or such people, or such a way of thinking, a world in which language permits the creation of such monstrosities as this sentence, even if it was fabricated, in a world in which even the fabrication of such a phrase sounds logical, sounds possible. And along with those feelings of paralysis, I felt awakening in me a need to redeem the life and the vitality that had been in him, in Bruno Schulz, and in his words and his stories. I wanted to redeem them from the cruelty and the indifference and the tyranny in which Bruno Schulz had to spend his last years under the Nazi regime, from the concision of the Nazi syntax, I have killed your Jew, very well, now I will go and kill. From the time I knew I was going to be a writer, I also knew that I would write about the Holocaust, the Shoah in Hebrew. As I grew older, I became even more convinced that I would not truly be able to understand my life in Israel as a person, as a writer, as a man, as a father, as an Israeli, as a Jew, until I understood my unlived life over there in the time of the Shoah, in the space of the Shoah. I wanted to find out what there was in me that I could have used to oppose the Nazis' attempt to erase me. What would have preserved my human spark within a reality that was totally devised to extinguish it. When I finished reading Bruno Schulz's book, I felt that I had been given a key, that Schulz gave me a key to writing about the Shoah. Not to writing about death and annihilation, but writing about life, about what the Nazis had destroyed in a massive and mechanized way. I wanted to write about life as Bruno Schulz taught me. Life that is alive, life times 10, life that is a continuous revival of people I have met, of moments past, of sights I have seen 1,000 times, of a word I have spoken or written thousands of times before. Every one of Schulz's lines is a rebuke to a world in which, as he put it, all meaningful things are walled up. A protest against tedium, banality, routine, against stereotyping of human beings, against the tyranny of the mob, against the shrunken and the simplistic, against whatever lacks daring and is devoid of inspiration and nobility, against whatever has no soul. In his story, Taylor's Dummies, Schulz wrote the following about his father. It is worth noting how, in contact with that strange man, all things reverted, as it were, to the roots of their existence, rebuilt their outward appearance anew from their metaphysical core, returned to the primary idea in order to betray it at some point and to turn into a doubtful, risky and equivocal regions which we shall call for short the regions of the great heresy. There is no more precise description than this of Schulz's writing itself, of his incessant search for the metaphysical core of things, but also of his capacity to change his point of view instantly and to turn at the very last second in the most ironic and ambiguous way to the regions of the great heresy. For this is the strength of this writer, who has no illusions about the arbitrary, chaotic and random nature of life, yet is nonetheless determined to force life, to force existence, both indefinite and indifferent, to surrender, to open itself wide and expose the kernel of meaning hidden in its depths. And although Schulz is a big believer in some significance or meaning or law that generates and regulates everything in the world, people, animal, plants, even inanimated objects, to which he always grants with a certain smile, souls and desire, he is still able in an instant to uproot himself from the faith and deny it absolutely with a sort of bottomless demonic despair which only intensifies our sense of his profound loneliness and our intuition that for this man there was no consolation in the world. In my book, Sea and the Love, Bruno Schulz appears both as himself and as a fictional character. In his fictional cover, I smuggled him out of wartime Drohobych, under the noses of the literary scholars and the historians, to the pier of Danzig, where he jumped into the water and joined a school of salmon. Why salmon? Perhaps because salmon have always seemed to me the living incarnation of a journey. As you all know, salmon are born in fresh, sweet water rivers. They swim there for a few weeks and then they head for salt water. At the sea, they travel in schools of millions for thousands of miles until all at once they send some inner signal, a pulse, and the entire school reverses direction and begins to return home to the place where its members were hatched. Again, the salmons swim thousands of miles. Along the way, they are preyed upon by other fish, by hawks, by bears. In dwindling numbers, they scoot upriver and leap against the current, through waterfalls 5 or 10 meters high, until the few that remain reach the exact spot where they were spawned and lay their eggs. When the babies are hatched, they swim upon the dead bodies of their parents. Only a few survive to perform the journey a second time, perhaps as the leaders of the school. When I first heard about the cycle of life of salmon, I felt something very Jewish about that. This inner signal that suddenly beats the consciousness of the fish, bidding them to return to the place where they were born, the place where they were formed as a group. There may be also something very Jewish in the urge to leave that homeland immediately and wander all over the world, that eternal journey. But there was something else as well that drove me to choose salmon, something deeply connected to the writings of Bruno Schulz. Reading Schulz made me realize that usually in our day-to-day routine, we feel our life mainly when it's running out, as we age, as we are losing our physical abilities, our health, and needless to say, when we lose beloved relatives and friends. Then we pause for a while, we sink into ourselves, and we know there was something here, and now it's gone. It will never come back. And we shall never again be as we were before we lost it. And we may recognize in a sudden, poignant way that we understand what we have lost truly and deeply only when it is gone. And when one reads Schulz, page by page, one suddenly senses the words returning to their source in his words, returning to their source, to the strongest and most authentic pulse of the life within them. Suddenly we want more. Suddenly we know that it is possible, it is legitimate to want more. That life is greater than what grows dim with us and steadily fades away. When I wrote the Bruno chapter of my book and described an imaginary scenario in which Bruno flees the failure of civilization, the perfidious language of humans, and joins a school of salmon, I felt that I was very close to touching the root of life itself, the primal naked impulse of life, which salmon seem to sketch in their long journey on the waves of seas and oceans, and which the real Bruno Schulz wrote about in his books, and for which he yearned in every one of his stories, the longed-for realm that he called Age of Genius. For him, the Age of Genius was an age driven by the faith that life could be created over and over again through the power of imagination and passion and love. The faith that despair had not yet overruled any of these forces, and that we had not yet been eaten away by our own cynicism and nihilism. The Age of Genius was for Schulz a period of perfect childhood, feral and filled with light, which, even if it lasted for only a brief moment in a person's life, he would be missed. This moment would be missed for the rest of his years. Did the Age of Genius really occur? Schulz asks, and we, his readers, ask along with him. Was there ever really an age of sublime inspiration, when men could return to childhood, when mankind could return to its childhood? An age when a primeval river of life, of vitality, of creativity gloriously raged. An age when essences had not frozen into their forms, when everything was still possible and flexible and plentiful and childlike. Did the Age of Genius ever occur? Schulz wondered, and we wonder with him. And if it did, would we recognize it, answer its secret call? Would we dare to relinquish the elaborate defense mechanisms that we have constructed against the wildness and volcanic abundance of such an age, defense that have bit by bit become our prison? A few years after Schulz wrote that line, came an age that was the utter opposite. An age of beastly murder, of massive, faceless destruction. It happened also here, in this place, on this ground. And yet, to that terrifying call, many responded, so many, with depressing eagerness. In Sea and the Love, I struggled to bring to life, if only for a few pages, a feeble echo of the age of genius, as Schulz had suggested it in his writings. I wrote about an age in which every person is a creator, an artist, and each human life is unique and treasured. An age in which we adults feel unbearable pain over our fossilized childhoods and a sudden urge to dissolve the crust that has congealed around us. An age in which everyone understands that killing a person destroys a singular work of art which can never be replicated. An age in which it is no longer possible to produce or even to imagine such sentences as, "I have killed your Jew, now I will go and kill your Jew." Stalin once said, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistics." When I read the stories of Bruno Schulz, I can feel in them and in myself the ceaseless pounding of an impulse to defy that sentence, an impulse to rescue the life of the individual, his only precious, tragic life, from that statistic. Even the word Holocaust or Shoah has become for many people no more than a hollow concept. A symbol, yes, a symbol of dreadful events, but only a symbol. Contact with those events has become abstract, sterilized of pain and drained of meaning. This was another reason why I was driven to write Sea and the Love. I have always hoped that the people who read this book will feel and understand that the millions who were murdered in the Shoah, the 6 million Jews and the many millions of other peoples who lost their lives in the Second World War, that each and every one of them, men, women and children, was an age of genius, a unique and idiosyncratic work of art that will never be restored. In recent years, I've been going back more or less once a year to the stories of Bruno Schulz. For me, it's a sort of annual tune-up, a strengthening of the antidotes against the temptations of apathy and withdrawal. Every time I open his book, I'm amazed anew to discover how this writer, a single human being who very rarely left his hometown Drohobych, how he created for us an entire world, an alternate dimension of reality, and how he continues even now, so many years after his death, to feed us grains of sugar, so that we may somehow make it through the long, endless winter. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję.